Hey, Bianca here. So today we're going to be figuring out how do you know what quadrant your triangle is going to be located in. So I want to just quickly review the different rules talking about your quadrants. So if we remember from the other day, we think about the saying, and the one I like to use is All-Star Trig Class. I say, okay, All-Star Trig Class, so ASTC. Now, if you remember, A stands for all. All of your trig functions are going to be positive in that first quadrant. S stands for sine, and its reciprocal, cosecant, are going to be positive in the second quadrant. T is for tan, and its reciprocal, cotan, are going to be positive in the third quadrant. And lastly, you have C here, which is cosine, and its reciprocal, which is secant, are going to be positive in the last quadrant. So let's look at some examples. Okay, so let's start with the first one. Now, with the first one, we have the, here they're giving us inequalities that tell us that the sign is greater than 0, which means your sign has to be positive. Here we have tangent is greater than 0, which means tan is also positive. So what I like to do is just rough sketch out our ASTC in the quadrants. And what I like to do is cross out where I know it cannot be. Okay, so cross elimination kind of. So here we know sine is greater than 0, which means sine must be positive. So I want to cross out where sine cannot be located. It cannot be located anywhere. It is negative. So I know that sine is negative here and here. So I'm going to cross that out. It has to lie somewhere in quadrant 1 or 2. I then look at the second part that says tan is greater than 0, which means that is positive, and I know that if it's negative, it cannot be in that quadrant, and tan's negative here, so it can't be there, which means since it's positive, it has to lie in quadrant 1. So the answer to this first one would be quadrant number 1. Let's look at the second one here. I'm going to use different colors so it stands out a little bit. So once again, I know that tan is less than 0, so here it's got to be negative. And the cosine is less than 0, which means that that's negative as well. So I just rough sketch out the ASTC on the side. And remember, I want to cross out where it cannot be located. So if tan is negative, it can't be anywhere it's positive. So it cannot lie in quadrant 1. It also cannot lie in T quadrant because that's where it is positive. So right now we're between quadrant number 2 and quadrant number 4. Now here we know that cosine is less than 0, which means the cosine has to be negative, and it's positive here, which means it can't be there, so we are left with quadrant number 2. All right, let's try another example. All right, so we're going to finish with these 3. So if we look at the first one, we know that sine is less than 0, so once again it has to be negative, and tan is greater than 0, which means it's positive. So on the side, just kind of sketching out that ASTC here. Remember, crossing out where it cannot be located. Sine is negative, which means it cannot be positive, can't be in 1, can't be in the S quadrant, which is 2, because that's where it's positive. We need it to be negative. The second part tells us that tan is greater than 0. Tan is greater than 0, it has to be positive, which means it must lie here. It cannot be here because it's negative. So the answer to this problem would be quadrant number 3. The second one, we know that cotangent is greater than 0. Well, we want to go ahead and match it to its reciprocal function because remember they lie in the same quadrant. So cotan and tan. Well, we know that that has to be greater than 0, which means it's positive. Cosecant here is sine, that's the reciprocal function, and it's negative because it's less than 0. So I'm just going to quickly sketch that out over here, ASTC, and crossing out, remember where it cannot lie. Here, tan must be positive, which means it cannot be in 2 or in 4 because that's where it is negative. Here, sine is negative. Well, sine is negative, right? It cannot be in quadrant 1 because that's where it's positive. So it must be in 3 again. Lastly, here we have secant is less than 0. Now remember, secant matches with cos, or that's its reciprocal, and that is negative. And cotan matches with tan, and that is negative as well. Roughly sketching out the ASTC here. We know that the cosine is negative, which means it cannot be in the positive quadrant, so bye. And then we have tangent is negative. Tan cannot be located here because that's where it's positive, so we're left with quadrant number 2. Now let's apply this to do an actual problem. All right, So looking at this, I want to find the sine and the cosine given these things over here. Now they tell us that tan is equal to 5 over 12 and the sine is less than 0. They do not tell us what quadrant the triangle lies in like we did in previous problems from different videos. So if we look here, we need to figure out what quadrant it is in first. Okay, sine is less than 0, which means it is negative. I'm just going to roughly sketch out the ASTC here. If sine is negative, it cannot lie in quadrant 1 or 2. It's got to be in 3 or 4. I then look at the tan. The tan value that they give us is positive, which means it must be in your T quadrant, which is quadrant number 3. So I know I have a quadrant 3 triangle. I'm going to sketch that out. From the origin into the quadrant, up to my x-axis, there's my 90 degrees, and there's my theta, or my reference angle. Tan, remember, is TOA. So we have opposite over adjacent. The opposite of this angle here is 5. The adjacent piece here is 12. So we need to go ahead and find the hypotenuse. This is one of our triples, but if you don't know, you use Pythagorean theorem. You would do 5 squared plus 12 squared equals c squared. You do end up getting 13. So we want the sine and the cosine. Opposite, hypotenuse, and adjacent. The sine, right, of this angle theta is equal to opposite over hypotenuse. That would be 5 over 13. But is that correct? We still need to figure out what sign, meaning positive or negative, that value is in the third quadrant. All Star Trig Class. We are in our T quadrant, which means everything is negative except for tan and its reciprocal. So that means the sign is negative 5 over 13. We then also want the cosine, and the cosine is adjacent over hypotenuse. So here we have 12 over 13, and noticing here it is also negative. All right, and that's it for today.